Star Wars is one of the most interesting franchises that has continued to persist in the cultural zeitgeist, and I've thought about this a lot, and I think the main reason is that more than anything else, Star Wars is defined by nostalgia. But nostalgia is a constantly changing face. And so Star Wars is constantly rebranding what it's about and what it's trying to achieve to appeal to some sense of nostalgia. When George Lucas first made Star Wars, it was an appeal to a lot of different things that he kind of grew up with. Samurai films, Flash Gordon, sci-fi, and even fantasy. I've always said that Star Wars kind of feels like an RPG campaign that just happens to be set in space. It heavily plays into that genre-busting energy where it's a little bit of everything, but you can clearly identify the different sources of inspiration. And I think that those sources and nostalgia really impacted how people viewed Star Wars as a brand. Star Wars was about this gang of rogues becoming a found family, of outlaws seeking purpose and redemption, of good versus evil, and the subtle balance between the two. But as Lucas grew older and he evolved as a storyteller, he revisited the Star Wars brand to tell more stories in the past, establishing the story that would lead to the original trilogy. And fans absolutely hated these movies. Absolutely despised them. And the reason is that the prequels didn't really match up exceptionally well to the story established in the original trilogy, which the fans were all nostalgic for. And now, we've come back around to the point that people who are invested in Star Wars today, young people who grew up with the franchise, are more likely to be nostalgic for the prequels than anything else. And I think we've really seen this established thoroughly in two ways. Number one, the fact that online discourse about Star Wars, especially in YouTube videos, is increasingly homogenized, and you're pretty much going to find the same vibe and the same takes from every single Star Wars YouTuber. And number two, it is very obviously identifiable that Star Wars is going absolutely fully into prequels nostalgia, where pretty much every show is in some way a reference to those three movies, or the Clone Wars, or stuff like that. And today, people mainly believe that the Star Wars brand is about internal consistency and continuity and the family story established across those 6 movies. The Star Wars brand is Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker, James Earl Jones as Darth Vader, and Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, and the thematic connections between those 3 characters. And so if you're going to see a big viral fan project, if you're going to see a big, smart, Star Wars fan debate about the series, those 3 characters and the continuity between them is probably going to play into it, and there's going to be an extreme pressure put on the importance of Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker. And I think this is interesting when you look back at where the franchise was just 10 or 15 years ago. When I was in high school, I had this teacher named Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith taught a class called History versus Hollywood, and he taught other classes, but that was the only class I ever had him with. And the point of the class was that we would just watch movies that are supposed to be based on historical events. Then we would research the historical events, and we would write essays about how those historical events were adapted, accurately or not, into the film. And I learned about a lot of different interesting topics. Most importantly to me, personally, was I learned about the difference between portraying truth and portraying accuracy, and how those two things are not the same thing, even though most people would assume they are. But anyways, that's not the point. The point is that I would talk to Mr. Smith a lot just about movies. And one of the very interesting things I always thought about him was that he was a Star Wars fan who was like an original Star Wars fan. He was a Star Wars fan in the late 70s, early 80s. And he hated the prequels. He hated them. And it wasn't just like, oh, he thinks they're bad movies, he thinks they're goofy. Mr. Smith believed, fully, with any hesitation, that every creative decision that George Lucas made in the prequels was completely incoherent and didn't make any sense with the movies he grew up with. And it was really interesting to talk to him about this because these are perspectives you just don't hear anymore in the Star Wars spaces. And one thing he pointed out to me, he pointed out to me a few things, but the two big things he pointed out to me were that the ages don't make sense. In the original trilogy, Obi-Wan and Anakin are way too old. They're way too old for how old they should be. So they made the characters way too young. And the second thing he pointed out to me, which I'm always thinking about now, is that it doesn't make sense that they base the Jedi robes on the robes that Obi-Wan wears in Episode 4. Because in Episode 4, Obi-Wan has taken on a new identity. He's in disguise. But by making the Jedi robes identical to the outfit he was wearing in Episode 4, they've made it that it doesn't make any sense that he's wearing Jedi robes as a disguise in that movie. Now, you could argue this was just an issue in expanded media and even Episode 6 that, it's too late to turn back on, but it's just stuff like that is really interesting to me because he is right at the end of the day. Most of the stuff, when it comes to how the prequels portrayed the lead up to the original trilogy, most of it doesn't make sense. Any individual thing I could pick out from Uncle Owen, to just the technology, to some of the politics. It doesn't really match with the original trilogy, but you don't think about that today, and that's the thing that's really interesting to me, is that, like I said, 10 years ago, the conversations I was having with Mr. Smith, those were some of the most common Star Wars conversations. People were not shy about discussing not only how they didn't like the prequels, but how the prequels just don't make sense with the continuity of the original Star Wars movies. And today, you will not hear those takes when it comes to the big viral Star Wars YouTubers talking about stuff. And I find that really interesting. And in fact, I have a hot take that I've had for a while that I'm going to share here as a little prediction. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the Star Wars brand is going to reboot again. And they're not going to change the continuity, I think. Maybe they will, but I don't think they will. But what's going to happen is that suddenly, and without warning, Star Wars TV shows and movies are going to start appealing to sequel trilogy nostalgia. And you're going to see a lot of people coming out of the woodworks as, apologists for each of the movies. Not all three at once, but probably in like 3 or 4 years, or maybe sooner than that, you're going to have people making videos like, why The Force Awakens was the last good Star Wars movie, or in defense of The Force Awakens. And then a few years after that, people will be defending The Last Jedi again. And then in like 10 years, people are going to be defending The Rise of Skywalker. Even though I think it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. That's going to happen, I think. And a lot of you are saying, Quentin, that's not going to happen. I know Star Wars. I know exactly what Star Wars is, and I'm not going to be into any sequel trilogy nostalgia media. Well, that doesn't matter. It's not going to be made for you. If Star Wars was always made for you for the rest of time, Star Wars would die with you. So Star Wars constantly shifts and constantly reboots itself to appeal to current nostalgia. And, ironically, that's why the sequel films are kind of mangled right now, because the sequel films were made when it was commonly believed by everybody that the prequels were bad. And so it was made by people that were nostalgic for the original trilogy, but weren't nostalgic for the prequels, and they finished being made just when everybody was nostalgic for the prequels. So it got caught in this weird, kind of meat grinder that is the Star Wars brand. But I truly believe that as soon as people who were little kids when those movies came out, as soon as those people are adults, there's going to be a lot of money to be made off of their nostalgia for the films that everybody says no one will ever like. And I think that's going to be part of the future of the brand. And I think about this a lot because I often study kind of the past of Star Wars and the ways that things have changed. Because I think a lot of it's very interesting. And as the main example I would like to present a weird toy that I found on eBay. I saw this, I immediately thought it was really fascinating and charming, and so I bought it. And that is this. An action figure of Anakin Skywalker as played by Sebastian Shaw. So like I said, I bought this on eBay, and from my memory, I think this toy came out in like 1997. Because in the late 90s, George Lucas had been basically doing studies into the Star Wars brand to try and figure out if it was still popular enough to kind of do some more movies theatrically. And I think the conclusion he came to was that if he did a bunch of prep work, a bunch of lead up to the release of the prequel films, they would be profitable. So he had a bunch of expanded universe, video games, books, toys, and stuff like that be produced, around that time. And so this would have come in like a big fancy toy collector box, and this was supposed to be the ultimate, final action figure representation of what Anakin Skywalker looked like. Because to fans who grew up with the original trilogy and not really anything else, this was one of the most important performances in those films. This was the canonical depiction of what Anakin Skywalker looked like before he died and he became Darth Vader. In case anyone needs a refresher, towards the end of episode 6, Darth Vader basically sacrifices himself to kill the Emperor and save Luke. And in the process, he goes back to being Anakin Skywalker in his final moments. And he decides to take off his mask and strip himself of the Darth Vader character, so in his final moments he can look at Luke with his own eyes, and you see Darth Vader under the mask, kind of withered and bald and mostly hairless. In the original edit he had eyebrows. And he speaks to Luke with a thick, slurred British accent, and, he says, you were right about me and all this stuff. And then he dies. And it's a big moment that reveals Anakin Skywalker and, particularly importantly, reveals that the Darth Vader voice is some kind of synthesized thing and he doesn't really talk like that because he has a British accent. Then Luke goes down to the planet, he parties with some Ewoks, and he sees the 3 Force ghosts, Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Anakin Skywalker. And it's very much a moment where, you're not thinking about the Force ghosts as lore-oriented immortality. You're not supposed to be thinking about it that way. The Force ghosts represent these characters finally being at peace. There is balance to the Force. The Star War is over, etc., etc. Sebastian Shaw was a famous British theatrical actor. He was well known for performing in Shakespeare plays and adaptations. Outside of Star Wars, he doesn't really have any kind of mainstream pop culture, roles that he's known for. It was just this very interesting choice that they hired a famous, classical Shakespearean actor to portray Anakin Skywalker in those final moments. When he filmed that scene, Sebastian Shaw was 78 years old, and I think he almost lived to his 90s. And like I said, for many years, that was Anakin Skywalker. Him appearing like this as a Force ghost implied that this is what Anakin looked like before he became Darth Vader. Implying, again, that he was considerably old when he died, in the implied prequel story. And so for Star Wars fans who grew up with the original trilogy, this was the one definitive Anakin Skywalker, Sebastian Shaw, and that's why he was featured as this big collectible toy, because they were appealing to the completionist collector's nostalgia of the original trilogy. And that's fascinating to me because, literally, no one would ever make this toy today. I don't think you could. I don't think anyone would let you. And this wasn't the only toy of this actor that was made. I mean, for people growing up with those original films, this character in this outfit was one of the most important visuals in Star Wars, and today it's borderline erased. Infamously, when George Lucas was remastering the original trilogy, going back in and re-editing, he erased Sebastian Shaw from this scene and put in Hayden Christensen. I think there's a lot of different things you could say about this. Weirdly enough, I've always felt like the clip that's used of Hayden Christensen there doesn't work because it feels like an outtake. Hayden Christensen later claimed that he wasn't told what he was filming, so he didn't quite know how to act and that kind of thing. And I think you can tell it doesn't match the same atmosphere of the original version of this Shakespearean actor understanding the scene that he's portraying in that exact moment, which is one of those little telltale signs that, George Lucas was not a good director and wasn't good at directing his actors, while the directors of those final 2 films in the original trilogy kind of knew what they were doing. I was watching a Star Wars video the other day. I apologize, I can't tell you which one. All Star Wars channels are kind of the same to me. And in the video, the narrator went, "I think we can all agree that it was the correct decision to put Hayden Christensen in Star Wars Episode 6. And again, that is such a weird statement to me, because 10 years ago, this was one of the most contentious debates in Star Wars. A lot of fans were really, really offended that they took this actor out of that sequence. And in fact, I think a lot of Star Wars fans today still feel pretty mixed about this, but again, the most vocal online Star Wars voices are kind of homogenized, and in my opinion, all kind of say the same things. I would go as far as to say that from my experience, it is a common prequel fanboy fantasy that one day we might see an edit of Star Wars Episode 6 where Sebastian Shaw is digitally removed and replaced by Hayden Christensen in the same makeup, trying to imitate that performance. Because a lot of Star Wars fan content these days, and even official content, is built around, finding that sweet spot of building perfect continuity between episodes 3 and 4. And Anakin Skywalker suddenly having a very thick, slurred British accent is something a lot of fans just don't want to deal with. And so they view Sebastian Shaw's performance in this role as a continuity screw-up and nothing more. It's an embarrassment to Star Wars that they would rather just see erased. And so a lot of Star Wars fans are literally looking for this guy to no longer be in the movies because he doesn't match with that idea in their heads of Hayden Christensen being the one and only Anakin Skywalker. A few years ago, I watched Kenobi on Disney+, and this is one of the only Disney Plus Star Wars shows that I have completely finished that I'm up to date with. Most of the other ones I kind of fell off with at some point because they make so many damn seasons of these shows. But they made one season of Kenobi, and it was still too much. I mean, parts of Kenobi are great. It's just too much stuff. It should have just been a movie. But anyways, the best part of Kenobi is in the final episode, I believe, where there was a long battle between Kenobi and Darth Vader that they work so very, very hard to fit into episode 4's very vague dialogue. So there's this big fight between them, and Darth Vader's mask gets sliced open, and you see it's Hayden Christensen in there. And you hear Hayden Christensen's voice coming out, and it keeps switching back and forth between Hayden Christensen's voice and the James Earl Jones AI voice to create this very creepy and really satisfying transition between these two voices just shifting back and forth. And it's one of the most fascinating depictions of Darth Vader. And as somebody that does love prequel-era continuity, it's one of my favorite things from Disney-era Star Wars.
Anakin is gone. I am what remains.
But there was a specific thing I noticed the first time I watched that really made my spine shiver. It really hit me to my core. And that is that I swear to God, there are moments in that scene where Hayden Christensen is doing a half-convincing Sebastian Shaw impersonation. And I have tried to broach this topic with so many other Star Wars fans. I post about it, on X.com. I've mentioned it to people in real life. Nobody else has ever had this hot take or ever mirrored that. No one else has ever been like, oh, that's exactly what I thought when I watched that for the first time. But every time I rewatch it, I hear it. There's specifically the part where he goes, "You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker." It's like that.
You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker. I did.
But it's gotten to the point where I sometimes wonder if the reason that I'm the only person that notices that detail or hears that detail is because I'm one of the only people in the world that wants that to be there. I'm one of the only people in the world that really respects what Sebastian Shaw did for this character that we're still talking about, that he borderline originated, and I want there to be some level of respect for him. I want to imagine that Hayden Christensen would sit down before recording that scene and watch Sebastian Shaw clips so that he could very subtly impersonate him for a second. So that when you watch that scene and then you watch the final Darth Vader scene, it kind of feels like it meshes together right there. I want to believe that this actor is respected enough in the modern Star Wars productions that they would want to do that. But because no one else has ever made that connection or had that hot take about that performance, I'm pretty much convinced that it's just in my head. I just find that really interesting at the end of the day, that, you know, people always seem so confident about the ultimate perfect view of these nostalgic brands. People in 1999, they knew what Star Wars was, and they could give you a perfect hot take about what Star Wars is. And people in 2015, they felt the same way. They knew what Star Wars was. They could tell you what Star Wars was and what the prequels got wrong. And now, every Star Wars fan that's folk on the planet, they all know what Star Wars is, and they can tell you exactly what Star Wars is, and how the prequels got it 100% right, and how the sequels got it 100% wrong. And in 10 years, we're going to be having a completely different debate, because there's going to be a different demographic of people who have different experiences that are ready to have their pockets picked for the current nostalgia. And that's just a reality that I think about a lot, that I never see anyone else talk about, because it's easier to believe that because the current opinion is this, that will always be 100% right, and the entertainment industry, especially when it comes to this brand, will never change. But yeah, that's my off-the-cuff, unscripted analysis about lapse nostalgia, Sebastian Shaw, and the Star Wars brand. With that, I've been Quentin Re2s, and that's all you need. All right, that's enough.